Hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Reporting on Iran often slips into a world of cliches. Today we're going to be speaking with an organization that does anything but that. For the last 14 years, the Tehran Bureau has been providing in-depth reporting on Iranian politics, economy and society. They've been partnered with The Guardian and PBS and won numerous awards for their in-depth journalism. Over the next hour, we're going to be speaking with Tehran Bureau's director and founder, Kelly Golnoush Niknejad. Hello, Kelly.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And their director as well is here with us, Marketa Hulpachova. Hello, Marketa.
Hello.
Yeah, we had a few problems getting you online, but we've got you here, which is great news. Much of the news coverage about Iran focuses on nuclear weapons and its tension with the West. But we've got an opportunity here to talk about the things that affect ordinary Iranians from day to day, such as medicine and sport, and also, I think, get a deeper understanding of how Iran is run. Kelly, we'll start with you just to get us an idea about how you formed the Iran Bureau and what were your ideas behind it. And I should add that while many people may not have heard of the Bureau, they may well have actually read your reports that have appeared in The Guardian or in PBS, as well as places like the New York Times. Just tell us a bit about the thinking behind putting this organization together, Kelly.
Basically, having lived both in Iran and the United States before, during, and after the revolution, by the time I came back to revisit Iran as a journalist, I could see that I would have to negotiate access with the Iranian government. And in order to do so, I would completely deteriorate the journalism, really have to make concessions that, weren't the reason I got into journalism in the first place. So it just, because of the revolution happening online in terms of, Iranians gaining access to the outside, being able to go directly inside with Iran, I just decided that there's a lot of people there who could report stories directly instead of having to negotiate credentials and datelines. And so the whole purpose of it was to do better journalism without having to try to constantly negotiate access to Iran.
Great. Well, you've produced some fantastic stories, and the range of reporting is really amazing. We're going to have a look at the website and some of the stuff you've been doing in a moment. And I'm going to turn to Marketa, who is the research director. I know you've also got a personal story that's very interesting. You were based in Iran until 2014, is that right? And then that's the point at which you were arrested and then subsequently expelled, is that right?
I personally was not arrested, but Jason Rezaian, who was a good friend and a member of our sort of journalism network there, was arrested. And that had an effect on all of us. So at the time of his arrest, I was actually on a break outside of Iran, had all my stuff there, planning to come back. And when that happened, just decided for a lot of reasons not to. And that happened to a couple of members of the Tehran Bureau team. Our researcher hasn't much, she definitely had to just pack up and go based on Jason's arrest. And yes, none of us traveled back since.
None of us have been arrested. None of us have ever been arrested. We work very carefully and we know our limitations. And so knock on wood.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of this, but the amazing thing is that you do very in-depth reporting. The information you come up with is amazing, and how you get that is something that we'll come on to in a second. I should just say we have had a bit of a glitch just before we were coming on air trying to get Marketa on, and so it's been a problem with Zoom at her end, so that's why Marketa is literally in the dark. But we've got you there now, which is great. Let's your focus in the last in the September issue of effectively the magazine online focused on business and politics in Iran and those overlapping networks of very powerful clans in Iran, which I think those articles give you a really good understanding of who's who within Iran and how that kind of economic and political power works and overlaps. Do you want to say a bit more about the purpose of the stories, Marketa? What were you trying to do?
Sure. So I have to say a little bit about the background of our research and how we got there. Basically, we started back in 2016 when the JCPOA was still a hot topic. We decided that to start focusing on covering the Iranian economy and business in a way that just wasn't being done before, wasn't being done, because nobody had any information about who owned what and who the big players were. There were a lot of rumors about how the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, runs everything, but it couldn't be proven, none of it. And the thing is that the public records were all actually there, and still are to a large degree. It's just a lot of work to sift through them and look for the patterns and see what emerges. And that is what we've been doing for going on 5 years now. Okay. And it's meticulous work. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to say, for those who don't know it, the IRGC is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And maybe, Kelly, it's worth saying a few words about them, because it's more than just a sort of military unit. It's a sort of the guardians of the regime, both military and also sort of, as we're going to discover as well, an economic powerhouse as well.
It's basically a parallel government. The Islamic Republic learned from its lesson with the revolution and the Shah. When the military turned against the Shah, that spoke the end for that regime. And in order to kind of safeguard against that, they have this parallel government. They have the military, they have all the branches of government that you saw before the revolution in other countries, but here's another one that's going to safeguard it. And I think that that is probably, it's essentially a military force, and they have a lot of power. After Khomeini died and President Rafsanjani encouraged them to get into business, they got more and more into it. And yeah, they're an incredible force, military, economic, ideological, cultural.
Okay, well, let's look at some of the research you've conducted. If we can just bring up that website, Isabel, and we've got several pages who we're going to look at. Now, this looks sort of very detailed and complex, but Marketa, just give us an overview of what we're looking at here and what was your purpose.
Sure, of course. So this is just an overview of the whole political business empires project. I know it looks scary, but it's really, we are just trying, because we're dealing with so much data, to just break it down into smaller bits. So what we know in what we've learned from political business empires is that Iran is run by a couple of very powerful clans. At the center of these networks is always one very powerful politician who is also a businessman, and they are all men. So here in this complicated map, you have kind of an you can see, you know, how the different, what sectors they have their hands in, who the different players are.
If we get move the cursor, if we there's a chap on that. No, keep back on that. Or we can maybe go on the center. This one in the center of this little spider here. Stop, Isabel. If you go to Mohsen,
it's the purple one.
If we go back up to the purple one, and then if we see there's a chap called Mohsen Rezai, and he's on the left. He's Word Media.
He's the big guy, and we will talk more about him actually in all. His name comes up in a lot of what we're going to be talking about. He's probably, I would say, arguably the number two, definitely in the top 5 powerful men in Iran, and he's the founder of the IRGC actually, and he also is the head of something called the Expediency Council, which is this kind of unelected body that has the right to veto anything the legislature passes. And also it has this, it's kind of an extended arm of the executive, if you will. So he runs that. He also runs a really vast network of businesses. And you will see that a lot of these guys, including Razai, are also involved in media. So, you know, you hear a lot about state-run media in Iran reporting this and that. But what's interesting and isn't very well known is that all of these top guys actually run their own or are very involved in some ways, have probably employ their family members in the top news agencies. And these top agencies will then sort of, you know, be hit at various times. If they have a political row, the news agencies will sort of be used as mouthpieces to, you know, kind of air their views on a certain topic and badmouth the other guy. So that happens a lot. But there's also there are also connections to, they also all own little smaller charities and are also connected to something called bonyads, which if depending on whether or not we know much about the Iranian economy, are what runs the Iranian economy. Bonyads are these, they're supposed to be charitable foundations, but they're actually huge conglomerates. And under those conglomerates, there's basically everything. All the big oil companies, the big pharmaceutical companies, you name it, it's all run by the bonyads. And the bonyads are they have all these subsidiaries in which they install their own people and make sure that everything stays in the power of these business networks.
I want to come to another example, and possibly the exception to the rule that you talked about earlier, which is a male-dominated regime. You know, these are big businessmen and politicians who are at the heart of these networks, and often connected to the IRGC as well. But here's possibly an interesting exception. We're going to look at the pharmaceutical industry, and this woman here, Nahale Naraki. Can you just tell us a bit about the organization she works in, the network that she works with, and also, I think for people who've traveled with us with political tours, we have seen hospitals, we've seen clinics, and one of the things that really struck us on one trip was that we went to visit a small village. My wife's a doctor, many of you will know Karen, and when they found out that she was a doctor, the whole village came out. They were asking her tons and tons of questions. And one of the things that came through and during that visit was the cost of medicine, how incredibly expensive some of that medicine was. And I think this here, we have a part of an explanation as to why that is. Tell us a bit more about this, Marketa.
Absolutely. So we picked Nahale Naraki as a case study of how the pharmaceutical industry actually works. Nahale Naraki is what could be called a serial entrepreneur in the pharmaceutical industry. And we think this might be because she has many contacts abroad. She's got companies in Switzerland, and she also has co-owns companies together with some Indian entrepreneurs. And we think that this makes her very desirable as a business partner for members of the Iranian regime. And so she gets special treatment. So this woman was involved in a case in which a company called Octover imported a drug that is produced by a company based in India called, excuse me, what is it called? Hetero it's called. Yeah. And Hetero is actually kind of a big player. They produced this drug called Losartan, which is used for hypertension. And they had a recall a couple of years back because they found out that losartan was potentially cancer causing. The recall was global. You know, most of the markets where it was sold immediately pulled the drug, but in Iran they did not immediately pull it, even though they knew that there was a recall. They kept it on the market for another 6 months or so. And after there was eventually an investigation, there were allegations that this was because the minister was trying to, the health minister was trying to protect Nahal and Naragi.
So
Why would he be doing
Iran
that?
has an equivalent of the FDA. It has its own sort of Food and Drug Administration.
Yes.
And they act, with Iran imports a huge amount of drugs, and they would approve these drugs. And what you're saying is, in this case here, that they did not issue that order for 6 months. Is that correct?
Yes, they waited, exactly. And when you look at who's in the Food and Drug Administration, you can see it's all the health minister's cronies. It's people who also have worked with Bonyads. It's all part of the same network. And even more interesting is that the health minister himself founded a company together with Nahal and Naragi, and there's no record saying that he divested his shares before becoming health minister. We tried, of course, to contact them, but they wouldn't talk to, they wouldn't respond.
Yeah.
But
I should stress, for in terms of legality, we don't know of Nahal and Naragi being accused of doing anything illegal. We just know that this drug stayed on the market for 6 months. She's also got a son who has both her children are involved in her companies, and her son, one of her sons, works in Spain and comes back and forth. I thought that was a very interesting. You show these big conglomerates often have very strong international connections, which
exactly.
If they're a big company, you'd expect that from them.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes people like Naragi very valuable to the regime, because, under sanctions, obviously, it's hard for them to get their money out and to make more money that way. So Iranians like this who have access to companies abroad, who have contacts abroad and have, even co-founded businesses with with international actors who are very active and successful in the pharmaceutical field. That is a big deal for the regime. There were allegations.
I was reading on the website that one of the key accusations against the pharmaceutical companies who have these very strong sort of political links is overcharging for drugs. In other words, the cost of the drug in India would be a fraction of what it would be in Iran, and this company in particular has charged very large amounts for some of its drugs.
Absolutely. So here's where it comes full circle. Here's why. The funny thing is that the pharmaceutical industry is considered lucrative for these kinds of businessmen who are, in cahoots with the Bonyads, who are kind of partially state-owned, is that the government itself is subsidizing the pharmaceutical industry to a large degree. Somewhere in the story, there's a very high number, something like $300 million went to pharmaceuticals in subsidies in the last couple of years, just to prop them up, just for the idea is that they can then import drugs from abroad at normal prices that aren't prone to inflation, and then, offer them to Iranians at a decent rate. But that has not been happening for years. And it's nothing to do with international sanctions, with the way the economy is going. It's really corruption from within that's causing this.
Okay, let's, if anyone's got questions, we've got plenty of time to deal with those. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box here down on the left-hand side, and we'll take those in just a second. So please do start filling those questions in now. Let's move on to another area. Football, soccer is huge in Iran, and so is martial arts. And we come back to the figure that we were talking about earlier. This is Mohsen Rezai, the founder of the Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Right. So this article here is more of a listicle, because we literally are just focused on the sports aspect of Rezai's bigger empire, which, if you scroll down in that article all the way at the bottom, you will see that he's got a huge, it's something like 300 businesses. If you go all the way down to the very end, just to give you an idea, we're not going to go through this, but this is the entire network of this one guy, Mohsen Rezai. The sports story is basically about his brother, Omidvar, who who has a hand in not only the Esteghlal Football Club, but also the Taekwondo Federation, also the Football Federation, and the Wrestling Federation. And the thing is, he's a doctor, right? He's not in any way, there's no reason why he would be qualified to do this other than being Mohsen Rezai's brother. And the bigger thing is that he's got this blaring conflict of interest, because he, he plays a role in the sports ministry and a couple of other regulators. And then he also owns the football club and is active in the federations. And so he's kind of has all the hats one could possibly have in probably what are the most popular spectator sports in Iran. And just sits there, controls it. Also, his son has played for Esteghlal Football Club for some time, for a short time, and according to what we found, it's not because he had any talent. So that's as much as our data shows. We can then theorize about what that means about small-scale corruption in sports, match fixing, and so on. But that much has not been proven by our data. Okay. This is just how it works.
Those are just some of the examples of the stuff. So please, if you want to go and look, please go and look at tehranbureau.com, and you can follow the tentacles, the web of networks, to see who's involved and what. It's quite mind-boggling. Kelly, it's quite an achievement. How do you go about getting this kind of information, bearing in mind that the people who work for you could get into severe trouble for it? And how have you handled that in the past, and how have things changed?
Okay, so when I launched Tehran Bureau in 2008, between then and now, surveillance has changed remarkably. And because we weren't negotiating with the government, I think the quality of the work comes from the fact that you're not compromising your reporting and what you're saying. And that has a lot to do with it. Fortunately, because of this model, we did not get anyone in trouble. No one has been in trouble. But when we relaunched Tehran, during about 4 or 5 years ago, when the Iran deal was just about to be signed, we decided that we didn't want to work with anyone inside the country, because it's just so unpredictable, and what is happening there in terms of, when things are better between Iran and the rest of the world, Iran and the US potentially, they crack down much harder on us, on journalists, on civil society, because no one cares. Everybody's so caught up trying to make money.
That's a really fascinating point. That you think they see this as an opportunity to crack down on you, or did they see you as a threat at that particular time to their interests?
Maybe a little bit of both. I think during the Obama administration, we felt that we were kind of being clobbered on both sides, because we weren't playing cheerleader to, everything is great, let's go conquer this untapped market. We continue to do critical reporting of the Rouhani administration, just as we had of the Ahmadinejad administration. With Ahmadinejad, it was easy. Everybody's on board and everyone's behind you. Yeah, let's clobber the guy. But when Rouhani came, there was a lot of vested interest in making him look like a good guy, someone we could do business with, and not just another face of the same establishment. So it became very difficult, and we just decided that in order to do more meaningful work, instead of what is seen very predictable in terms of what we would be covering and what we would be fighting against, because I think the narrative still in mainstream media is the conservative, the hardliners and the reformists, and it just takes a long time before what's really happening in Iran, and even the conversation that's going on in Farsi, catches up to what's really going on, unfortunately. And so we decided to work on data, because we thought that the Europeans and people interested in doing business in Iran would want to do due diligence. I asked them, at the Marketa, and I went to the conferences that were going on in Europe at the time, and I asked the Europeans and I asked lawyers, who do you use to do due diligence before you do business, or like they said IRGC oil companies and an investment company linked to the Supreme Leader's office because they really know what's going on. I said, isn't that a conflict of interest? And they told me to mind my own business, but data is our business. And so, but it's been very difficult to get the Europeans interested in our data because their position is we'd love to do due diligence, but we can't because we don't know who owns what. And we have been able to prove that you can actually do it.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Marketa, can you just talk about in your own experiences, how you did the reporting beforehand and then what you actually do now? And then we're going to start bringing in questions. There will be questions about, what's going on with some kind of deal with Iran. What are the hopes and expectations with the Biden regime? So we'll get all of that, and I'm sure you can answer those as well. But Marketa, just tell us about what was your reporting? What was it like to report up till 2014 to start with?
Sure. So my story is that I went to Iran as a student officially. That was my sort of cover. And, as long as I knew that, I had to be a fly on the wall, I couldn't, it's not like I could call up a government office and start asking questions. It was very much more trying to get sources through friends and acquaintances and eavesdrop on things that are going on at the university, and it just bring that kind of ground level observational reporting into the picture, and then email Kelly, I'm sorry, Golnoush, she goes by both, and then be like, okay, I need you to get in touch with such and such expert and answer these questions. So in a way, Golnoush would be the face of the reporter, and I would just sort of be the person in the background weaving the story together. And later on, we actually started sort of working as a bigger team where I would be constructing or working on a story with another Iran-based reporter, but all the communication would still go through Golnoush. So then we would actually not know who each other were.
You must have feared. I mean, when Jason was arrested, that must have been something you were anticipating or concerned about for some time. Both Marketa and then Kelly. Go on, Marketa.
Yes. So obviously, there's always the fear of arrest going through your mind, especially if you're, at a demonstration or somewhere very visible. And but I've taught, long before he got arrested, we would meet, Jason and I, and he would tell me, what kind of monitoring or other kinds of repression he was facing at the time. And the thing is, it got really easy right before he got arrested. He was very relaxed the last time I saw him in Tehran, and so was I. We all thought that with the JCPOA, things were just gonna be better and more open, and then bam, there it go, it went, the whole network. It was just, it's like, maybe it happens like that. The moment you let your guard down, that's when they get you.
I think, Kelly, you were saying perhaps there's a bit of a tactic in that, isn't there?
Yes, I think sometimes they let certain people work and they allow them to stay in the country, build a network, and once they arrest them, there's just a lot of interesting information that they can then map, see who their contacts are inside the country, how they get information outside, who they see, and after who they see, how do they report. So I think they amass a lot of information that way. So yeah, I mean, basically, as Marketa was saying, even though we had a lot of people inside the country, they didn't know each other. I would never, ever put them in touch with each other. So I felt as if I try to emphasize to people, our correspondents, that you're going to be much safer if you're just working for one person, that you're not going around telling everybody that you're a correspondent for this and you're also working for this person, because I know that other news organizations that don't have as much on the ground experience as we do will take certain things a lot more lightly. And I think the only thing that allowed me to sleep at night when I did sleep at night was that we operated as carefully as possible. And yeah, I think, but I couldn't, once I felt that I didn't know how much information, how much surveillance they had, how much they had advanced in terms of finding who's calling who, that's when I said, we're not going to work with anybody inside the country anymore. And the new Tehran Bureau that is data journalism, investigative reporting is now done without any support whatsoever from anyone inside the country.
Yeah, but it's amazing work nevertheless. We've got questions and lots of them here piling up. So let's start with Simon Jackson. Go ahead, Simon.
Hi. To what extent do you believe that the various pieces of the jigsaw of the regime, to what extent is there a consensus as to the purpose of the nuclear program? Is there at least some sort of agreement between them of the extent to which it is just the domestic power production and a sanction and bargaining chip, or is it really for something more belligerent? Or do people believe that the purpose of it is for something?
I'd like to chip in just a bit. I mean, circumstantially, and this is something that sort of Christopher de Bellaigue talks about as well, who led our Iran tours. There's a great pride in Iran's nuclear power program, and also the aim of achieving nuclear weapons. And the people we came across were quite explicit about that and saying, you know, Iran should have the bomb. There's nothing, you know, that's something Iran should be proud of. At least that was my experience. Marketa, what's your take? And then Kelly.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a pride in it. This kind of a broader question. Well, you know, if all the global powers have it, and why shouldn't we? If this is our only way of protecting ourselves, this is what we're going to do. I think that there's there used to be anyway when I was there, a lot of civilian support for it, and you know, definitely the paramilitary would love to have one. So that is, I don't see there being much opposition to that, although, you know, they put out diplomats that will tell you it's for peaceful purposes. I personally tend to think otherwise.
Kelly, what's your take, particularly if you bear in mind the next...
My answer is I have absolutely no idea, and they've very successfully kept it as murky as possible, and the same discussions for and against why they do have it or they don't have it has been going on in terms of you know, Khomeini before Khamenei, the supreme leader, saying that it's against Islam to do it and thus they wouldn't do it, but everyone else saying that you are allowed to lie under Shia Islam to maintain, you know, to protect yourself. So I really don't know, but apparently there was evidence that there had been some work on a nuclear weapons program that they dismantled a while ago. It's really difficult. And I think that right now it makes sense that they would trying to be ramping things up in order to get more concessions and make the issue of dealing with Iran, you know, negotiating a business deal, it makes them more urgent. So they've done an excellent job of making it impossible to answer that question.
I think almost they want to be in the process. They want to be seen as being in the process rather than actually achieve the end goal. I think this kind of process of it suits them very well.
Yeah.
Okay, so not actually getting to the point where they have nuclear. So then really it is about a bargaining chip and
yes,
extracting what they can from it. So, Simon, does that answer your question?
Sorry.
Go on, Simon. Let's come back to it because you're a bit muffled there. We can't hear you. And Nigel Harley.
Sorry. The answer presumably is we don't know, and that's how they like it.
Yes. Yeah. There we go.
That's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Nigel Harley, your question links into that, and then we'll come to Diane Cook. Nigel.
Yes, I mean, it looks as if the new administration, the Biden administration, would like to rejoin the discussions on nuclear disarmament. And I just really wondered what both of you felt about the impact of this, because obviously it could have major ramifications as far as sanctions are concerned. And we all know that the country is really very much suffering over the sanctions.
Right.
Okay, go ahead, Marketa.
Can I?
Yeah.
So there's under the Obama administration, when they got very, very close, the stick to they did offer some sanctions relief, of course, and then Trump got into office and reinstated all of them. But the sticking point to actually opening it all up and getting to the level that Iran wanted out of the nuclear deal was that the big banks would just not go into it. They were risk averse because they had gotten fined millions before, and they just didn't want to go into it. And without the big banks, Iran's liquidity was affected. It's just the regime really wanted access to a lot of foreign cash, and they didn't get it. And so this time around, there was an article recently, Golnoush, was it in the Financial Times?
The FT,
about how the banks are basically even more risk averse this time. And so I just, I don't see them getting this kind of grand agreement that they were about to do. But not that there won't be effort at all in all sides, but I just don't think that they're going to get what they wanted.
I'm kind of skeptical that because they felt that they got screwed on that deal, because at the end of the day, as much as the Europeans wanted to, we could do business with Iran, because everything U-turned with the US dollar, I mean, everything, they would still be subject to being penalized by OFAC. And so, they weren't going to get into it. And the back channels the Europeans established for credit, and it was fine for smaller companies and smaller banks that didn't have the US as a market. So I think this time they're going to be a lot more careful to make sure that those details of any such agreement work in their favor. And that part of it scares me, because I think that more than anything right now, they need financial relief. And it's the business part, it's the business diplomacy part of it that is, very important. But I don't see, based on the research we've been doing about who owns what and who controls what, how you can do business in Iran without doing business with the IRGC. It's just impossible.
Yeah, unless you ignore it, but
which they would like to, yeah.
Which they would like to.
Yeah, and they will. Probably.
I'm fascinated about when the last agreement was in place, we as a company were trying to take people, travelers to Iran, and it was extremely difficult. And making payments was, in actual fact, we had to change our bank accounts, and essentially we stopped traveling to Iran, not because of the hassle we received in Iran, and we did receive some. It was essentially because it was too difficult to pay, and we were worried about our bank accounts being closed. In fact, we'd had two sets of bank accounts closed down, and 3 money people we buy foreign currency from stopped trading with us. So, and that was off the back of just taking tourists there. We did have somebody at a takeaway in Leamington Spa offer to do some shadow banking for us if we needed to transfer money to Iran. And that was from the guy handing a takeaway, I think it was a Mexican, some kind of meal. So in the strangest of places, you can find access to global finance. Linked to this, Jim Lowenstein, you've got a question, and then we'll come back to Diane Cook and Hilary Matthews. So if we can take Jim Lowenstein next. Go ahead, Jim.
I wondered what the practical effect of these consequences of American sanctions have been. I mean, when I went to Iran, there were some sanctions in place, but merchants were accepting Visa cards. Can you give us an idea of how seriously affected the Iranian economy has been? And is this sustainable from their point of view? What if the sanctions aren't lifted?
Go on, Kelly, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think the way that the sanctions were ramped up under Trump really began to hit them in a way that it probably hadn't up to that point. and the fact that the Iranians probably knew that he was capable of doing anything, I think that scared them. And I think that just accumulation has made, I think it has been effective in terms of getting their back against the wall. And I think that the JCPOA, the Iran deal, did throw them a lifeline, and kind of this, and I think that it might happen under the new administration as well. So I think it has been effective. I would think for as much as most Iranians are suffering in the country, there would be more of a backlash or towards Trump and sanctions. But I was surprised by the number of Iranians from all walks of life that I heard from, directly and indirectly, actually saying we're willing to put up with it if it'll get rid of this regime. And that dialogue, that narrative is very different from the narrative that is going on in English on social media and at think tanks and in newspapers. So it's very difficult to tell, but I think it has been very effective in those terms. But the way that it was once described to me in terms of kind of ramping up the pressure against Iran is that, they're not at a suicidal level yet, but once they are, they'll, lash out in ways that are not, that they haven't yet. So it's hard to tell, but I think that because the pressure really, really got high in the past 4 years, a lot of Iranians supported Trump because they, whether directly because they're here and could vote, or because they were in Iran because they're like, this spells the end, we don't have to deal with this issue anymore. And I'm really surprised by the number of Iranians who didn't find fault so much with Trump as they did with, because he was the one who tore up the deal. So these are great questions. I wish I had clear answers, but it's just very nuanced and,
How have these sanctions affected the daily lives of Iranians?
Well, the last story that I heard from a friend was she was embarrassed when she goes into a supermarket because she saw people picking up, things they want to buy and putting it back. And she said, I feel horrible because I can afford it. So, I mean, in terms of just in terms of their buying power, and of course, I mean, it's hard to tell with the pandemic how much they've been affected by that, because things are just as, well, I won't say just as bad here, but they've been pretty bad here because for other reasons. I mean, probably a lot of people are dying because they're not getting the medicine they need. You see a lot of people asking if there's travelers and if people can get certain types of medicine to their relatives. I mean, right now it's very difficult to tell because of the pandemic and because of the way Iran handled it, which was not that unlike the way it's been handled here, to just kind of like, keep things open to the extent possible. So there's been a lot of deaths.
There's a caveat here though, because I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, yeah, go ahead.
It's always been like the sanctions are the problem behind Iran's economy, and we're just learning so much about it. It's hard to tell whether the economy was going down the tube because of sanctions or because of corruption. You hear this about Iran, that unlike, for example, Venezuela, they went and diversified a lot under sanctions. They started their own sectors in almost everything. They made, if we can't get the drugs, we'll make our own drugs. So on one, it should all kind of be working, but it's not. And I do think the sanctions have definitely had an impact, but the reason that people are feeling it on that, are feeling the inflation and the access to healthcare and why the entire social welfare system is going down the tubes, I think it has a lot more to do with corruption than Iranians have traditionally believed, and they're only now waking up to it. So Yeah, I guess if there were no sanctions, there'd be more money floating around, and maybe life wouldn't be as bad for Iranians, definitely. But I'm just a little bit averse now to saying, oh, it's just, it's the sanctions that are making Iranians' lives miserable at the moment.
And one other anecdote that I heard from Tehran recently was that they didn't have any shortages of anything because they weren't dependent on an international supply chain to get them toilet paper and food. And so
Exactly.
my understanding is that they had everything through the pandemic.
Right. The question I ask myself about sanctions is, often there's a cliche dichotomy between the hardliners don't want Iran to open up, so therefore they're against. They don't want any kind of agreement that lets the outside world into Iran and weakens their interests. But the reality is far more complex than that. And if Iran is going to open up, arguably, as you've just been saying, those key people who are within the IRGC, those are the people who are going to benefit because they're the most powerful people within the economy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're gonna make money either way. I think there are those sort of more old school figures who have already all the money and all the power they want, and they just don't want to share. And so that's where you'll see the sort of controversy between one wing or the other. But ultimately, the guys at the top, they benefit no matter what happens politically.
Exactly.
That's an ideological position then, you think? An ideological one. Yeah. Okay, Diane Cook, you've got a great question that follows up on this. Go ahead, Diane.
Hi, I think I'm not sure it's not just simply adding to what we've been talking about, but a few sort of minutes, well, more than a few minutes ago, when Kelly, you and Marketa were talking, I just thought to myself, and really prompted by that, I've done a lot of stuff on for my company on KYC, know your customer, and sanctions and things, everything, money laundering. I mean, why, as a foreign business person faced with those kinds of regimes in my own country, would I want to get involved in what you've described as a closed shop in Iran? And not just described, but depicted very, very in great detail.
I think it's just such a large, untapped, lucrative market. So whoever is going to manage to get in there first stands to make a lot of money. And I think part of the reason, by keeping things murky, they feel like it makes it possible for them to do business. And I think during the last administration, there was a lot of encouragement from John Kerry to kind of like, you guys should go and do it. And they were not as stringent in terms of imposing sanctions. So I think if you're big enough to take on the possibility of sanctions, maybe you do. You didn't under Trump, but maybe you start to kind of consider it again. And I think it just depends on the type of company. There's smaller companies who don't look at the American market. It's not that important to them, or it's not important to them at all. And it's actually, I won't say hardliners versus reformers, because I'll just say that there are different factions, and there are certain factions who prefer to see things remain closed because they're doing so well, but there'll be other factions who need the banks need the country to pass the Financial Action Task Force's guidelines for money laundering and transparency in banking, and trying to get updated software and training so that the Iranian banks, can start doing business. So it just depends. I think most compliance departments come down on your side in terms of it's just not worth it. It's really not worth it. It's such a damn headache, as you can tell from just the way that you've, your bank accounts being closed. For me, just having a news organization called Tehran Bureau, my God, what a headache. I mean, we get censored by Facebook and Twitter all the time. So they have made it very difficult, very to want for anyone to have the stomach to do business with Iran.
Kelly, there are, China who already has big investments in Iran. It's got car factories. We mentioned the Indian company that does pharmaceutical businesses. There are a huge number of companies in Dubai that make a huge amount of money by basically helping the Iranian companies to import and export. So there are people there already who've got an appetite. What we're really talking about is Western companies. So we saw a cement mixing plant built by Siemens. They had a computerized production facility, which was incredibly sophisticated, built by Siemens in about 2014, something like that, 2013, 2014. And yes. So big companies like that are the ones who like to go in with those kind of projects. And it's, are they going to have their accounts closed and be sued by the US Treasury as a result of it? I think those are the sort of the different equations, if you like. Let's bring in, we've got a question here from Annie McMahon, and then I'll bring in Hilary Matthews. So if Simon's still there, and if Simon, yeah, Annie, you're on Simon's connection there. So go ahead, Annie.
Hello. I am curious. I'm thinking a lot these days about inequality and income distribution, and what you've described about how business networks work. I wonder if it results in I'm wondering if it results in a high concentration of wealth, or it in contrast actually gives rise to a lot of network effect that spreads wealth throughout into the middle class.
I would say it's the former. I think that these networks are designed exactly to keep power and wealth in the hands of very few individuals, and in fact, sometimes you can see via these public scandals and political tips that the circle's actually getting narrower than wider. I think the income inequality in general boils down to who's got access to foreign currency, and those are definitely going to be the people at the top who get then the preferential access to the government reserves of dollars, etc. And you can basically make a killing twice, because just by doing those transactions, like you can you save a couple of, you import whatever you're importing, and then whatever you've got, you buy something that's of lower quality, you save money there, and then whatever you've got left, you sell on the black market for 4 times what you got your dollar for. And so that kind of thing is happening on a bigger corporate level, and it's happening on an individual level. So, and because of that, you've just got the more inflation the bigger the inflation gets, the more income disparity happens.
Right. I think corruption is so rampant, and I think it is so concentrated that you're not going to hear about corruption just from us. You're going to hear it from their own newspapers, from the supreme leader, from all of them. But it's always been based on anecdotes. They always use a scapegoat to get okay, we arrested somebody and tomorrow morning we're going to execute him. So that corruption there is over. But I think, as far as I know, are the only organization that is actually not relying on anecdotal evidence to show corruption, but using actual data. But
yeah. Okay, Marty Ryan, we've got to get these questions and the answers quite short too, because to everyone's questions. So Marty Ryan, and then I will come to you, Hilary, after that. So Marty Ryan.
Thanks. Given that you said the IRGC and the Islamic regime control pretty much everything, is there anybody who has any autonomy? And then as a continuation of that question is, where would the pushback come from against the regime, which I'm aware there is some strong thoughts about how do we get rid of the regime, but it doesn't sound, I don't know where that would come from.
Yeah, Marketa, can I start with you on that one? Because you were living there till 2014. I got a sense that whilst people were, many people were unhappy with the regime, that didn't mean that they wanted revolution, particularly as they saw the revolutions in the Middle East that went sour. And also, I don't think their frustrations don't necessarily mean that they might be fed up with their own government in the same way that we're fed up with our government. It doesn't mean they want a revolution.
So that was definitely the case when I was there. People were ready to go demonstrate in the streets and, get a couple of scrapes, maybe get arrested, but they weren't going to risk everything, their lives, their families, they did not want that upheaval. They did not want a revolution. And they were still hoping to reform the system from within. But I get the sense that has changed now. And I think Golnoush can speak a little bit more to the kind of voices she's hearing now about that topic. And in regards to whether it's possible to do something in Iran without being controlled by the RGC, whether there's any, I don't think you can be autonomous. I'm not saying that someone's gonna immediately get involved in your stuff. It's not completely totalitarian like that. It's more authoritarian, where if you don't rock the boat, you can basically do whatever you want, right? But as soon as you stick your head out a bit, someone is going to get you.
Yeah.
Right.
I find one of the most fascinating things that hold up the Islamic Republic is not so much this ideological religious class. It's actually middle and upper middle class secular Iranians who have multiple passports, who make a lot of money, who the regime needs, who they need access, they need to see their grandmother, they like to go. And so I think a lot of people just kind of go along with it because they know it's not worth getting killed over it. But since 1978, 1970, I shouldn't say 1979, this is the most critical that I've heard Iranians be towards the government. And this is the first time that no one can even speak in favor of a reformist anymore, because even until a few years ago, there's just, there was hope, there was belief that they could, but now the reformists are just considered as nasty as the hardliners. And I've never seen that before. It doesn't mean there's going to be a revolution tomorrow, but it is interesting how critical it is. And I think as far as I know, no one has thought of how they can, it feels like they're here to stay, but I've been hearing since 1979 that they can't. And so it's hard to tell. It's very predictable until it isn't.
Okay. Hillary, you've got a good question. Go ahead, Hillary.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Just to go back to the economy and the sanctions, an anecdote I just want that I remember very clearly when I went with Nicholas and Political Tours to Iran in 2016, and I remember our Iranian guide in Tehran telling me that the big problem with their airline industry is that they couldn't get spare parts for their Boeing airplanes. And that was, for him, that was a big issue because there's just not as many flights. Just one anecdote I remember about the effect of sanctions on ordinary people was the lack of spare parts for Boeing airplanes.
Yeah, you had a question about social media.
But
Hillary.
my question was that in the biography that Nicholas sent us about you, Kelly, it says that, and I quote, you were a trailblazer in incorporating social media into foreign reporting. And I would like to hear a little bit more about that and how you use social media, given its terrible reputation for misinformation and lies and awful things spread on social media.
I definitely do not use social media to incorporate that into reporting. The time that this bio, maybe I should change it so that it reflects that or takes that part out, was before anybody was on Twitter. It was before anybody was doing social networking. I was only using social media to communicate. Like, for example, when we had a website and it was taken down by the—
You're talking about 2008, 2009. You're really talking about that period then.
Exactly. When they took that down, they thought that I would no longer be able to publish the stories. So what I did was I went to Twitter and started putting out information on Twitter. And because I'm a journalist, because I'm a trained journalist, I was sourcing everything that I was putting out on Twitter. So now that people are doing that, I was doing that before people were doing that. And because there was so much information coming on, I started live blogging, and then everybody else started live blogging. There's absolutely no way in hell that I would use social media in the way that it comes across, I didn't realize it comes across that way, that I would be taking information or quotes or stories from people inside the country. Even when I had my own reporters working on a story, I would assign the same story to 4 different people, especially if there was a new reporter working, to see how each one of them reported the same story, to see if there was overlap or divergence, and why somebody might be reporting something differently from somebody else, and whether that would bring more nuance into a story or actually. So thank you for bringing that up. I will change that in my bio.
Okay, Sheila de Beleg. Sheila.
Hello, I'm just wondering, how important is tourism to Iran economically? There's so much to interest tourists there, but there's also so much to put them off going there.
Marketa, do you want to answer that to start with?
I think it's more of an image and brand thing, and it's hard to say, but the value of a brand does go far. I think Iran definitely likes to have its ambassadors, and it's true, if you visit Iran, it's beautiful, and everybody that I know that has done short trips there, it comes out leaves thrilled. And I think they do definitely want that. It's not, so the tourism industry isn't really, it's not a primary, so it's not a primary sector, but it would, I'm sure. Definitely, we are seeing that some of the biggest hotels are owned by some of these guys in our networks, and so they, I'm sure they would also like to make some money on that. But it's not. It's more of an image thing, more than like a big money maker in and of itself.
Let me ask you both a question. Do you think Iranian-US relations, or relations between Europe and Iran, are on the cusp of change, or do we just think that so much damage has been done by sanctions, and that these divisions are really entrenched? Are you hopeful that things are going to change in the next few months and years? Marketa, to start with.
I'm not very hopeful. No, I don't think. Even if I think that if it didn't work with Obama, I don't think it's going to work now. And not that it's not going to get better, because things are pretty dire now. But I think it's just that pendulum swing, just like Iran goes conservative and a little bit more reformist, and then it goes back conservative, same as the US in a way. And they just sort of like to follow each other's pendulum swings, and it just doesn't really ever get resolved. It would be a huge paradigm shift if it did.
Yeah,
I was struck by how the JCPOA really did very little to change business last time, as you said.
It was because of the dollar. It was because of the dollar, and the IRGC type factions wanted the big, plus $1 billion deals. So they were very unhappy that they weren't able to do it under the JCPOA. The small deals that were happening and allowed to go on just weren't of interest to them, not enough to make an impact. So yeah, like I think we referred to earlier, that they're going to make sure if there is another deal, if the Biden administration goes back, they're not going to get sucked in because of that loophole. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. In terms of things getting better, I think that they can hardly get worse right now. But the change, as Marketa was saying, is going to be very cosmetic. So while everybody's cheering, while like, oh, everything's wonderful, we're having these business diplomacy things, people like us are the ones. Well, I shouldn't say us because I'm not there, but it's yeah.
Civil society will actually get cracked down on.
Price, yeah.
Sorry, I missed the last point.
So it'll be people like us, civil society, well, journalists, civil society, people, human rights activists. Those are the kinds of things that will suffer as things appear to be better, you know, in the media and at think tanks and stuff like that.
Okay, there we have to wrap it up. Thank you both very much. It's been really, really interesting. I mean, again, to go back to what we were saying at the beginning, the kind of reporting that you do really gives, sheds a far bigger light on things than we're likely to read elsewhere. Thank you very much both to Kelly, Golnoush, Niknejad, and Marketa, Hulpachova. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.